All right.
Squirrel.
So,
Oh, it's so jumpy.
my next unit, or this unit, I should say, is about cells. But we're going to start off talking about a few different topics that aren't quite directly related to cells. The kind of general things we need to talk about at some point. And so this is, we call this taxonomy or classification. So, what do we have up on the screen?
Squirrel and
Let's just start with the left side. Little chunky squirrel. Okay. So, what tells you that's a squirrel?
its tail
Its tail.
and its ears a little bit.
Yeah. So you've seen these lots of times,
Yeah.
right? You've learned over the years that this thing looks like this. We call it a squirrel. And you see lots of them. Consider them all squirrels. Are there any other groups we could put this in? So what can you say besides this is a squirrel?
A bunny.
Okay, Kate said a rodent.
It kind of has the
Well,
power
what is
of
a,
bunny.
okay, what's that mean, Kate? You're right. So why did you call it a rodent?
Small and pest.
Hostish, okay. You might call it a rodent. Any other terms for this? Is there anything we could call it that's a group bigger than a squirrel?
Rat.
No, it's not a rat. What's some other term we might use for something like that?
A vermin.
Not that means the same thing. A more general term. What's a word that might include the things you just mentioned? A bunny, a rat. Is there some other group that things that look like this might belong in?
Like chipmunk.
Chipmunks, and one of these also, but that's not a chipmunk. But a chipmunk and a bunny and a rat are all part of a larger group of things.
I'm so confused.
The fact that it has fur, does that put it in a bigger group of living things?
Well, almost everything has fur.
No, not a bird,
Uh,
not a lizard.
does. A wolf does.
True, a wolf is in this group as well.
Mammals.
What's that mean?
It's a land creature.
Yeah, a mammal is a group of different organisms that have some certain characteristics in common. Like what?
Lungs.
They do have lungs, they have fur, they have some other things. How about, can we go even bigger? So that we have squirrel, that's that species. And squirrels, their species, is part of a bigger group we call mammals. What's an even bigger group that would include all those things we just talked about, but also birds or fish or worms? They're all called something very simple. What do you call things that run around and move and eat? And they're not these.
Tree.
That's a tree.
Animals.
Animals. Animals are an even bigger group. That includes lots of things. All those mammals you talked about, and birds and worms, okay? And sponges, and jellyfish. All those are part of an even bigger group. All those groups that we're talking about, all those sort of categories are groups that we use when we're trying to classify organisms, try to figure out where do they fit. What would you call this?
A tree.
Can we be more specific? You probably can't based on the picture. Like, what are some examples of types of trees?
Mahogany. I'm like maple tree.
That is a maple tree.
Oh, it is.
That is.
Because you could see its leaves are bigger than.
Yeah, so this is a maple tree, right? A specific species of tree. It belongs in a bigger group that has different types of maples. And that belongs in trees that lose their leaves. And they belong to the group of plants. So we have these groupings we use that help us to kind of make sense of the world and allow us to put things in certain categories. And that's what we think, that's what we're talking about as we're studying this topic of classification or taxonomy. So classification in science, it's a way that we group organisms. We put them into categories like the categories you're telling me just now when we were looking at those pictures. So taxonomy is the science that studies that. So classification is putting things into groups based on their characteristics and their traits. And taxonomy is the name for the science that studies that. And scientists have been doing this. People, humans, have been putting things in groups. That's our nature. We like to look and try to make sense of the world by grouping things together. And so all the way back to ancient Greece, people have been doing this. And they've come up with different systems of what the group should be and how big they should be and so forth. Ever heard of Aristotle, a Greek philosopher? He lived about 2,400 years ago. He decided, well, when we look around the world and we try to categorize things, there's going to be three groups. Things that live on land, things that live in water, and things that live in the air. Kind of makes sense. As time went on, people started coming up with different systems. That's Aristotle. In the 1600s, John Ray came up with a different idea. That was John Ray. He classified things not on where they live, but on sort of the structure of their body, what parts they had, what they looked like. He came up with the term of species. And so a species, you looked at the squirrel picture. That was a gray squirrel that I showed. That's all things that look kind of like that are gray squirrels. And they're all one species. And what that means is they can mate with each other. All gray squirrels can interbreed. They can mate with each other. They can produce offspring, and those offspring are fertile to keep the species going. That's what we often use as a definition of a species. So a squirrel and a chipmunk are two different species. They can't mate together. So they're two different species. Isaiah?
But they're the same species, but there's different. There's black and brown squirrels too, but they won't mate, will they?
They will.
They will.
So yeah, Isaiah brings up a good point.
And there's white ones too.
Because we just talked about this with evolution, right?
Yeah.
Are all gray squirrels identical to each other?
No, some have bigger tails, some have smaller tails, some are skinnier than
What's
another.
the word we use for that? They have variation. Like Isaiah said, the tails might be bigger, shorter, fluffier, lighter, darker. Yeah, there's hundreds of things we could come up with, differences between those squirrels, but they're still one species.
Yeah, but they live in different parts of.
They might live in different areas, but like we're all one species.
Yeah.
All humans are a single species, but we still have variation amongst us. And sometimes with species that are very closely related, like a coyote and a dog,
What about a fox?
they can sometimes actually, even though they're not really the same species, they sometimes can interbreed and produce a hybrid species, like a coy dog. But typically those hybrid species can't reproduce on their own.
So does that mean a coyote and a wolf?
I don't believe they can interbreed. I'm not familiar with any instances of that. So they're separate species.
Unless it's selective by humans.
Unless what?
It's selective.
Right, unless humans transform them into another species. Okay, moving forward in time. So we started off, Aristotle said, well, there's things that we'll classify them based on where they live. Then John Ray said, well, I think we should classify them about their body parts and their structures. Okay?
How they're built.
Carl van Lin, who is the scientist that actually, we still use the system he came up with. It's called Linnaean taxonomy. He lived in the 1700s. He came up with this idea, well, you know that gray squirrel or that sugar maple tree? Well, in English, we call it a sugar maple. In Germany, they call it some German word. In Spain, they call it by a different term in Spanish. Well, maybe what
they call it different names.
Right, it's the same species. So Carl van Lin said, well, why don't we agree upon specific names for species? He came up with a system called binomial nomenclature. He wrote about this idea in this book called System Naturae. And with this system, every species has a special name with two parts to it. It's usually written in Latin. Latin, the language. Latin's a language that people don't speak anymore, not actively in their everyday life. People use Latin, but it's not like something they talk to each other in any community around the world. So he said, we're going to give every species that's identified a special name in Latin that everybody will use. And then everybody is sure they're talking about the same thing. So if you're a scientist in Germany, you're talking about Acer saccharum. That's the binomial name for the sugar maple tree. And it's the same name I would use here in English. And it's the same name they would use in French-speaking Canada. They would all use Acer saccharum when they're researching this specific type of tree. So it allows scientists to be sure they're talking about the same organism. The scientific name has two parts, Acer saccharum. It's the genus and the species, which we're going to talk about. So when you told me about the squirrel in the tree, if I said gray squirrel, that's very specific. That's one single species. But then I said, well, we could call that mammals. That's a bigger category that includes many other things. And I said, well, we could also say animals. That's a huge category. That includes, a tiny little worm and a human and all sorts of things that are also animals. So we have these different levels when we classify things that go from very, very broad and general, and each step along the way get more and more specific. So the terms we have for them are listed here on the left. These are the major levels of classification. The biggest group is called the domains. There's only 3 domains. Every single organism fits in one of these 3. We're in the same domain as a mushroom. That's how general and broad they are.
We talked about this yesterday, right?
Did we?
Yeah. No. The day before.
We did?
Yeah. Didn't we?
I don't know.
Because we were talking about something.
Then we go a step down and we get to the kingdom level, which is smaller. Then we go phylum, class, order, family, genus, and eventually species. So imagine ourselves as humans. Where do we fit? So our domain, the biggest group, we're in this domain called Eukarya. It has to do with our cells. We'll talk about it. Then we're animals. We're the group our phylum is called chordate. This is all of the animals that have basically a spinal cord. Okay, so we're getting a little bit more specific. So we're chordates, so is a squirrel and a snake and a fish, but not a worm, okay, and not a sponge or a squid. So we're getting more and more focused. Our class is mammals. So we're with the other animals that have fur, that nurse their young, that give birth to live offspring.
Like humans.
Yes, we're part of the mammal
The platypus,
class.
they say so.
Yeah, there are some exceptions. Good. Then as we getting more, we're in the order primate. That puts us with in the same group as gorillas and apes and chimps and things like that. Then our family is called Hominidae. We're the only members of this that are still alive on Earth. Our genus is Homo, and our species is Sapiens, which gives us a scientific name. Our species is called Homo sapiens. Homo is the genus, sapiens is the species. This means knowing man. That's what Homo sapiens means. So that's where we fit. We could do the same thing for a gray squirrel. Would this be all the same if we were looking at a gray squirrel?
No.
Where would it be the same until? What do you think?
Species?
Are humans and squirrels in the same domain? Yes. Are we same kingdom? Yep, we're all animals. Chordates? Yes. Mammals? Yes. Primates? No. This is where squirrels are in a different group. Okay? They're not primates. They would be in a different group. What if I think about a fish, a trout? Same domain?
I mean, yeah, they got
Yeah. Same. Are they animals? Fish? Yeah. Do they have a spinal cord? Yes. Are they mammals? No. So they would split off here. How about an earthworm? Eukarya? Are they animals? Yep. Do they have a spinal cord? No. They split off here. How about the maple tree? It's Eukarya. Is it an animal? No. They split off way up there. So the farther down in the system you go, the more similar the organisms are, the more characteristics they share, the more closely related they are. Taxonomy and the study of science, we don't have to go into all the detail here, developed and got more sort of, more kingdoms were added as time was going on.
It's over.
Yeah, they started off just plants and animals as two kingdoms. Right? And Linnaeus gave us this system of naming things. Then another kingdom was added when scientists started finding like microscopic living things. They said, well, this isn't quite a plant or animal. And they developed a new kingdom, Protists. And then scientists discovered tiny little living single-celled organisms, bacteria. And they had to add a kingdom for the bacteria. Then in the 1960s, they realized actually fungi are not plants. They actually are different. And so fungi were added. And then in the 1990s, a new group called Archaea was added based on research that scientists did. So the system changed over time. And today we have a system where we have 6 kingdoms and 3 domains. And how organisms and species are related is something that scientists often will study. Which is most closely related to a gray squirrel? Is it a chipmunk or is it a rabbit? And they can research these things. And what they can do is they can make these diagrams that we already looked at a little bit when we were talking about evolution. These diagrams are called cladograms, and they show the relationships between different organisms. Remember I had to do that cut and paste activity with the branching tree? That was a cladogram, basically. It was showing how species are related. Yep, that. So here's an example. This kind of diagram shows us some species, and it shows us sort of how they evolved. They have certain characteristics in common. Everything after this has a jaw. Everything after this line, they all share the characteristic of having lungs and claws or nails, okay, and fur and mammary glands and so forth. So we can build a little diagram that shows us how species are related depending on their characteristics. Here's a more complicated one. This shows us a bunch of mammals. This is how scientists believe that these different mammal species are related. So let me ask you a couple questions. What kind of land mammal is a bat most closely related to? A shrew or a mole? We look up here, find the bat. There's the mouse, I lost it. Anyway. So yeah, the bat, if you trace it back, its closest relative is this shrew or mole, if you go back in time. Which makes sense, right? If you think about like a little shrew or mole, like a tiny little mammal, kind of looks like a bat, but without the wings. How about, what's most closely related to a squirrel?
Beaver.
What?
A beaver.
A guinea pig.
A guinea pig are actually a little closer.
Yeah.
Yep. And it makes sense. Like these things are kind of similar to each other. A rabbit is a little different than some of these, but they're all kind of somewhat similar. So we can use these diagrams to help us understand how species have evolved over time. So we're going to talk about some of these groups and what characteristics puts things in certain groups. So these are terms you've learned before, I think, in maybe 7th grade science, but we'll review them. So these are major characteristics that determine when something is a certain kingdom. First, their number of cells. Some organisms are made of just one single cell. That's all the whole organism is. Okay, you got to fill in here. So we call the name for that is they are unicellular. Like a unicycle has one wheel. Unicellular means it's one cell. Other organisms are made of many cells. Us, for example. We're not made of just one cell. We're made of trillions of cells. We are multicellular. Many cells. We're going to be looking at cells eventually. When we look at a cell, if you remember from 7th grade, where's the DNA in a cell? Anyone remember that? Usually in the nucleus. Some types of organisms don't have a nucleus. Their DNA is just all spread around the cytoplasm. That's what puts things in these categories. So if they don't have a nucleus, they're called prokaryotes. If it helps, remember, underline pro, because pro rhymes with no. They have no nuclear membrane. So what do you think a eukaryote is?
Huh?
What about eukaryote?
Yes.
It has it. Think about this. Eu rhymes with do because eukaryotes do have a nucleus. They have a membrane around their DNA. So that's an important characteristic. We have the number of cells they're made of, whether or not those cells have a nucleus, also how they get food or nutrients. Some things we call autotrophs, and some we call heterotrophs. Does anyone remember what an autotroph is? Auto means self. Troph means feeding. Self-feeding. What could that mean?
Produces its own nutrients.
You're very close, Kate. It's a producer. It makes its own food. So what are we talking about? What doesn't have to eat anything? What makes its own food using just sunlight and plants? So plants are autotrophs.
I remember learning this.
Yep. So then what's a heterotroph?
Right.
Right. How do heterotrophs get food? They have to eat. They have to eat things. Wolf is a heterotroph, but so is like a mushroom. It like decomposes things, and that's what it eats. So heterotrophs have to consume other organisms. The last factor that's sometimes used is the cell wall. Some things have a cell wall, some don't. And they're made of different types of molecules. So these are the things we look at. When we put things in the big groups, domain, kingdom, we are looking at these things. So we're going to talk about the different kingdoms and domains, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about them and tell you some of their characteristics. I don't think there's a lot for you to write here, just a few things. So bacteria. The domain bacteria contains single-celled organisms, unicellular organisms. These are things that don't have a nucleus. They're prokaryotes. No. Some of these bacteria can make their own food, they're autotrophs, and others are heterotrophs. So that could be mixed. Also, they have a cell wall that has this, it's made of a special compound called peptidoglycan. Don't have to worry about that. One thing we didn't mention in our previous slide, reproduction. Some types of organisms can reproduce asexually, meaning basically they just split. They just kind of copy themselves. Other organisms reproduce sexually. It means they need to find a partner organism, exchange genetic material, and then the offspring has a mix of DNA from both parents.
I believe it was Mr. Archaea that showed us a video of a single cell splitting up into like 50 of them.
Yeah. And it's probably a bacteria. That probably happened pretty quickly, right?
Yeah, it was really fast. It just sort of went.
Yep. So bacteria can reproduce asexually or sexually. Sometimes bacteria come together and they exchange little bits of DNA. So they can actually reproduce either way. Does anyone know a name of an actual type of bacteria? No?
No.
Sometimes if you think about diseases, you might, because bacteria sometimes cause infections. or food poisoning or things like that. Do you know the name of a bacteria that could cause food poisoning? You probably learned about it in like home and careers.
I never had one.
Salmonella.
Salmonella.
Have you heard of E. coli?
Like what turtles? Like what
I remember
turtles? Salmonella.
Oh, they could carry it? Yep.
I was thinking of salmonella, but it kept coming out as like sepsis in my head. I
Yeah.
don't know why.
So strep bacteria that cause strep throat. The name for those type of bacteria are called streptococcus bacteria. Streptococcus bacteria.
Was the black death bacteria?
Did you ever hear of strep throat?
Yes, I've had it both.
Yeah. And you know when they put that big
Yeah,
Q-tip back your throat?
Yeah, it's the thing that.
They're testing to see if these bacteria are there. Because that's a type of bacteria that causes sore throats. And if you have strep throat, you have a bunch of these bacteria growing in your throat, and the doctor might give you an antibiotic to help control them. If your strep test comes out negative, you might just have a virus that's causing a sore throat. And antibiotics are not going to help you. That's why they do that test. They want to know for sure. A staph infection is often a skin infection or a wound infection that's caused by Staphylococcus. E. coli. There's lots of types of E. coli. Some of them live in our digestive tract, and they're good. They help us. They help us break down food. Others are bad for us. They could cause food poisoning. Blue-green algae is a type of bacteria in the ocean. So here's what these bacteria look like. They have, mold is a fungi. So they have different shapes. Sometimes they form colonies. Sometimes they're grouped up together. So, and that's what their names actually mean. But that's what these bacteria look like. They're really small.
It's not about this, but it's about like glass. Do you want to know what we talked about?
What?
Poison dart frogs.
Oh, yeah?
Because they're different, like their colors. There's like green ones, blue ones.
Yeah,
ones.
we could talk about them. I saw some this summer.
They're super bright.
I went to Costa Rica this summer, and I saw some poison dart frogs.
I had to do a lab on them when I was in 8th grade.
Yeah, we could talk about them.
It was fun.
When we get to ecology, we could talk about them. So remind me. All right, another domain. Remember, we're in these huge groups. So we have bacteria with those characteristics. Archaea are these weird organisms that scientists didn't even know existed until 20 years ago. They're also, it's going to sound like they're very similar to bacteria. They're also unicellular. They're prokaryote. Some are autotrophs, some are heterotrophs. They're different because they have a different type of cell wall. And scientists found these organisms, these archaea, in some weird places. Scientists found archaea in deep sea vents, where you have gases from inside the earth are emerging in the deep, deep ocean. Methogen and other gases, which scientists thought nothing could ever survive these conditions. But actually, when they looked a little closer, they found these organisms living there in extremely salty conditions where almost anything could not survive. They found some of these archaea. When they look at hot geysers, like where you have heat from within the earth emerging, boiling water conditions.
Under the water.
This is on land where, you ever see a geyser where water spurts from the ground? And it's really hot, this water. Most things couldn't survive, but scientists found archaea there. So once they started finding these things, they actually found them all over the place. And they gave them their own group. There you see some of the conditions you could find them, this boiling hot areas. And they kind of look like just little single cell bacteria. Okay, finally, the last group. The group we belong in, Eukarya. Okay, this is a group that organisms, the kingdoms in it, have nucleus, they have other organelles, and it has 4 kingdoms: protists, fungi, plants, and animals. So these are starting to get to be things that are more familiar to us. Hey, you asked about amoeba earlier. This is the group that contains the amoeba. So within the domain Eukarya, we have the kingdom Protists. Most protists are single-celled, but there's a couple that are multicellular. They do have a nucleus. They're eukaryotes. Some of them are autotrophs, some are heterotrophs. So this is a category that kind of, it's just a mix of like things that really didn't fit other places. That's what scientists think about protists. They can reproduce sexually or asexually. So they're kind of like modern scientists wish we didn't have this group, because the things are just put in there kind of randomly and they're actually not that closely related. Like if we look over here, hold on, like protists are in yellow here. And so they're kind of like not all that closely related to each other. But it is what we have. So they're still in there. And these include things you looked at maybe in 7th grade. Amoeba, paramecium, euglena. Those are 3 protists commonly that we look at. And they come in different categories, these protists. Some of them move around like animals. They swim around. They move from place to place. This, for example. You know what this one's called?
No.
This blobby one? That's an amoeba. It just kind of oozes around. That's how it moves from place to place. When it's going to eat, it just like blobs around its food and engulfs it. Kind of neat to watch. Some move with these tiny little hairs called cilia that swim around in the water. Some have a tail that whips around, sort of pulling it through the water. So there's different types of protists. And you could, if you took a sample of water from a lake or pond and looked at it in a microscope, probably would find in it protists like these. Okay. There's also algae Archaean protists. They're plants. They're like plants.
Wow.
They have some interesting shapes. They have like these spiral shapes. Kind of neat looking. Kelp. These little things, these are diatoms. These are tiny little protists. They make the shell. And actually, they use some of these diatoms in toothpaste. They're these little shells, actually, in your toothpaste that help scrub, like, plaque off of your teeth. So they're kind of neat to look at in the microscope. Hey, kingdom, fungi. So, what are fungi? Besides me, I'm a fun guy.
What?
I'm a fun guy.
No, you're not.
Mr. Eukarya meant
Yeah. You made that joke too?
Mr. William, he has so many dad jokes.
I think saying that I'm a fun guy is a dad joke, isn't it? Science dad joke. Anyway.
They're all bad dad jokes. They're all in the same circle.
I picked
Yep.
up a book about helium. I couldn't put it down.
No. You don't like them, Isaiah?
Huh?
You don't like dad jokes?
They're corny.
I know, that's the point of them.
Dead.
So, fungi are decomposers. What does that mean?
They disintegrate the food or the surrounding area that they eat.
Yeah, they break down like dead animals and waste products and decaying matter. So what's an example of a fungi?
It's kind of like what flies do.
Kind of, yeah, you're right.
The mushroom.
A mushroom is a fungus. So most of these fungi are multicellular. They're made of many cells, but there are some that are unicellular, like yeast. You know what yeast is?
Yeah.
What is it?
It's like, isn't it like kind of like flour, but it's like, if you use water with it, it gets sick.
Yeah, yeast is it's actually a living organism. Like if you go to the grocery store, you can buy that little foil packet of yeast. If you pour it out, it looks like little brown kind of pellets. They're actually living fungi. And you mix them with water and some kind of sugar or flour, and what do? What does yeast do when you put it with?
It gets like,
Yeah,
that's
the
why,
dough rises.
That's why cake rises in the
Yeah, or breads.
because it has some yeast.
Yep. Well, not all cakes don't have yeast usually, but breads do.
Some of them
Yep.
do.
Some do. And so they are a living organism. They're eating sugar and carbohydrates in the dough, and they're burping up carbon dioxide gas, and that gas bubbles causes the bread to rise. When you slice loaf of bread, the little holes you see in there, that's
Like banana bread.
yeast burps. Yeah. They have a nucleus, fungi. They have to eat other things, right? That yeast you put in your bread, it's eating the dough. The fungi growing out of the ground, they're eating dead matter in the ground. They produce this fluid that breaks down materials and then they can absorb it. They have a cell wall. They can reproduce with spores. Examples are mushrooms. Kate mentioned mold earlier. Yeah, mold is an example. Mildew that might be in like a bathroom or something before you clean it. Yeah, it's like a film, like I don't know what color. Like sometimes it's red or yellowish color. Like in wet areas, like might grow in your shower, or mold might grow in the shower. What's that? Soap scum. Yeah. Yeast. All these things are fungi. So fungi.
Ooh, that's a pretty mushroom.
Yes, not a pretty slice of bread.
Ooh.
But
throw it away.
That mold on the bread. That's a living organism. That's fungi.
It's eating the bread.
It's eating the bread. Exactly. It's decomposing it.
Then it's just gonna be no more.
There you go. There's our mold.
That's someone that doesn't know how to.
Yeah, that's
wash
Mr.
the
Curry's
shower.
bathroom.
Oh.
I took it at his house when I went over there. So yeah, that's all mildew and mold. This is yeast. This yeast, one of the ways it reproduces, it forms these little tiny yeast that grow out of the sides called budding. In my front lawn, we used to have a tree, and we cut it down and like ground the stump. But now every spring, there's like a ring of mushrooms that pops up, and they're exactly the shape of where the tree was. Because there's still like roots and wood in the ground, and those mushrooms come up every year, and they're breaking down that wood there. That's why if you think about where you find mushrooms, like in the woods or something, growing on a dead log, growing on a tree, they're breaking it down.
In my aunt's backyard, we had like you see the trees outside. We had a massive one of those in the backyard, and we had to cut it down because it was going into the power line. So we cut it down, and then there was like all around, like you were talking about mushrooms.
Oh yeah, they grew.
Yeah, and then a couple of years later, we found out why, and it's great stuff. So now they don't grow it.
Okay, yeah, they're breaking down the wood that was still left underground.
Now there's no more, so they.
Maybe it killed them, or maybe they ran out of food.
Made a big dip in the ground, so then when we put it back, we have to watch out because we'll break our ankles in there.
Yep. Plants, the kingdom of plants. Are plants unicellular or multicellular? Multicellular. They're made of many cells. Like those trees out there, they're many, many cells. Do plant cells have a nucleus, you think? They do. They're eukaryotes. How do they get food? What's the word we used? Autotrophs. Good, Kate. They're autotrophs. In their cells, they have chloroplasts that they can absorb sunlight and use it to create food for themselves. They have a cell wall made of cellulose. Do they reproduce sexually or asexually? They can actually reproduce sexually. Plants reproduce sexually? That seems weird. Yeah, pollen that you may be allergic to, that might get on the sidewalk that's green or yellow. That's actually like
that's on the trees outside sometimes.
Yeah, that's actually one of the reproductive. That's like the sperm cell of plants is pollen, and that pollen, when it lands on the egg cell in a female flower, it fertilizes it, just like animals reproducing. There's male and female reproductive cells. When they combine, they form a new offspring. Don't even worry about the details, but there are some plants that grow low on the ground. They're called bryophytes, things like mosses.
Yeah,
they can't grow big because they have no parts that can move things around, so they have to be relatively small.
It looks like grass, but
yep.
Can't grow that.
Most of the plants you're thinking about are called vascular plants. They have tubes that carry water and nutrients around. They're called the xylem and the phloem. Ferns and wildflowers, trees.
Oh, that tree is pretty.
Yeah.
When I go outside and I see the leaves, like when they start falling, I go around and I pick up the pretty trees and then I take them home and I laminate them.
Oh, that's cool.
No, I mean the leaves. I pick them up and I laminate them and I just put them up.
Like, do you iron them with like wax paper?
Or
you have a laminator?
I have like a laminator. We put the leaves in there and then we put the clear paper and then we put it in the laminator.
That's cool. You decorate with them?
Yeah, sometimes.
That's cool.
That's what I have to do when I go home because then they're going to start getting crunchy and I'm not going to want to use them.
Yeah,
break in there.
Did you already collect them?
I collected a couple of them. We're going to collect more.
That's really cool.
Crunchy leaves.
Can you bring one in so we can see it?
Yeah.
Awesome.
I will tomorrow.
Okay, cool.
I'll make a couple so you can hang them up.
Oh, I could keep them?
Side of one there and one over there.
Yeah, well, definitely.
Or in your office.
Both, yeah, I'll put them in both places if you bring me two. Thanks.
I'll probably make a whole bunch to just bring them and give them some of the teachers.
That's a nice idea.
Decorate.
All right, let's pause our notes. We've been doing a lot of notes. So I'm going to show you a couple of videos. Maybe we'll come back to this, maybe we won't. But we will finish eventually. So I know there's a lot of material, and like a lot of this you don't really have to know, but I just want to talk about it with you so you can see some examples of these things. I lost my mouse, though.
It's in